Hello, music lovers. I'm Gregg Bendian, and this is the ProgCast. And if you're a fan of this podcast, you are probably aware that I am a huge fan of contemporary, rugged individualist composers like Edgar Varese, Frank Zappa, and Charles Ives. And today we're going to be talking about Charles Ives. And we are in for a treat because we have with us an Ives scholar, an important player in the music of Ives and its legacy and its future. And his name is James Sinclair. Jim Sinclair is my guest today. Hi, Jim. How are you?
I'm terrific, and it's nice to be with you, Greg.
My pleasure. Jim is a conductor of Orchestra New England, and he is someone that's involved with the editing and updating of Ives scores for performance and making all that stuff happen so that Ives music can be enjoyed around the world, which it isn't being enjoyed even more these days than I think in recent years. So we'll talk about all of that and get into some of the really interesting corners of Ives music. There's so much to talk about. But Jim, I wanted to get into how you first fell in love with Ives music.
Well, it goes back to high school. I was a junior in high school when Leonard Bernstein was doing one of his young people's concerts, and he talked about American music. In it, he mentioned Charles Ives, and I go, who? And then they played the 4th of July, and I just flipped. It made the hair in my arms stand up. I was so thrilled by the inventiveness of the sound, the energy in the music, the humanity in the music, that I went immediately to, this is Washington, D.C. I went to our big public library and I pulled out recordings and scores. There wasn't a lot. The year is 1963. And but I found the Second Symphony, the Third Symphony. I found the Three Places in New England, and I was amazed. The Second Symphony was completely unlike the 4th of July, same spirit perhaps, but texturally. And the Third Symphony was so hymnic and relatively laid back. The one that really grabbed me the most was probably Three Places in New England, and especially at that age, the excitements in the Putnam's Camp Middle Movement. Little did I know, some years later, I would be the editor of that piece and restore the original score and marry the original large orchestra scoring to Ives's 1929 small orchestra version recomposition of the piece. So I ended up owning that piece that I had fallen in love with.
So did you study as an instrumentalist before you worked with conducting, or what was your
Yes,
entree?
yes, yes, certainly. I started out with cello and trumpet, um, and excelled at trumpet. I went to Indiana University on trumpet and graduated there. Then I went on to being an assistant conductor at the University of Hawaii for just a couple of years, got a master's degree, and then came to Yale to show John Kirkpatrick, the curator of the Ives Papers, the famous man that had premiered the Concord Sonata. And he said, "This is interesting stuff that you're showing me." It was Country Band March being resurrected. And he invited me to stay forever. So I came for a 1 hour visit and stayed for the rest of my life here in New Haven.
Wow, that's actually an incredible link that you have to Ives, is that you work with Mr. Kirkpatrick.
At
And
length, yes.
and I wonder if you could talk about that relationship and the process of what you two were doing to come up with really the ideal scores and a performance practice of Ives music.
Well, John was deeply in editing piano works and choral works, which had been part of his whole background, but not much in orchestral music, which is why he was a bit stunned when some little kid comes in, age 24, I think, and says, here's Country Band March. and I've resurrected it from its missing page, which goes back to Three Places New England's Putnam's Camp. And I saw where the missing page music was embedded in Putnam's Camp, and worked it backwards to match the stylistic level of Country Band March, one of the source pieces of that movement, Putnam's Camp. And he was very impressed with what I had done, and he saw, wow, this guy's an orchestral guy, so he's a perfect match. He went after some Guggenheim money and made me a job, in a sense, outside of Yale in that first year. And then I became part of the Yale faculty and on through the 70s. And after that, in the instance of premiering Ives' pieces like the Country Band March, I've ended up inadvertently founding an orchestra, which survives to this day. It started as the Yale Theater Orchestra in 1974 to celebrate Ives' centenary. And then the players were so thrilled. They had just made a recording for Columbia Records, so it was a nice debut. We just decided to keep playing. And that orchestra just last month recorded a new disc for Naxos Records. So the Ives business for my Orchestra New England, continues to flourish.
That's so exciting. I love the notion of the different versions of Ives music. It's something, as a super Ives fan, that I've always tried to hear the early version, the later version, all the different arrangements of material that appear in different pieces repeatedly, certain bits that we know so well, quotations, but also just some of his original ideas that get reset. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the different versions, what goes into that process, and what corrections might be, what you could constitute as corrections, what you could constitute as other versions. How does this process work, Jim?
Well, it opens a big subject. I'll tack some of it. I'm sticking with Three Places New England. I've composed that as a large orchestra piece.
First.
Yes, and that was long about 1911 or so. A lot of it's slightly guesswork and each movement's slightly different, but it was all married together in the mid-teens, and that's the way it sat. It was a great piece of music, and Ives knew it, but he didn't have an orchestra that would play it. He did get a little bit of play by attacking Walter Damrosch and the New York Symphony to get them to read the first symphony, sent them the second symphony score. The conductor wasn't impressed, and the score disappeared. So it was all kind of slow and heavy. And Three Places New England came back to mind in the 1920s when Nicholas Slonimsky said that his Boston Chamber Orchestra would be glad to play a piece of Ives. Interesting. Ives could have handed him the Third Symphony. That was sitting there and ready and exactly the right size. But boy, he wanted to hear Three Places New England. So he went at it, recomposing the work, adding density because he was going down to a small orchestra. And it occurred to him that some of the energies of the large orchestra be lost. So he added density, and it's also the advancing stylistic track of Charles Ives. But I really think that the diminution, the reduction from the large orchestra down to small motivated Ives to do this kind of additional density in the chords, sometimes extra lines. I've recorded the earliest version amongst things when I did all three orchestral sets for Naxos. I didn't want to just do another recording of the large orchestra version, which is a hybrid. I'll end up explaining, but the thing that I just thought, well, while we're at it, let's have the original version. You listen to that, And it sounds, especially in the outside movements, it sounds exactly like what we know, and yet it isn't exactly what we know. Yeah, it's got a simpler lines. In the beginning of the first movement, the St. Gaudens movement, there's a bar that he added later that is a lovely little evocation where the mists start to clear and you begin to see. This is a trademark Ives thing. Outside of that, the movement progresses with the same feeling, the same message, the same warmth, the same dedication to honoring Black souls of the 54th Regiment that the St. Gaudens bas-relief in Boston Common honors. And, I think it's completely satisfying, even though it's 2 decades earlier style. There's nothing lost in the message. And similarly with the last movement, the Houstonic at Stockbridge, arguably the early version has one more layer of noodling strings, giving us the mists and ripples on the surface of the water. But really, they're just very similar. No matter what Ives did to it later, nothing is really changed. It's not the central message of these pieces is so important that it doesn't matter what the garb is, and that I think Charles Ives got from his theater orchestra experience, where it was just like a jazz band, sort of a seat of the pants. Who's here? Let's play. You take the solo. Ives felt when he was working with a small band that it was most fun. So he really liked small ensembles and that sort of flexibility. But so those are the version things. In the middle movement, Putnam's Camp, Ives did a much better job of knitting together his ideas, of creating the transitions between the two source pieces for Putnam's Camp. One's called Country Band March that I already referenced, and the other is the Overture in March 1776. Those two very Americana pieces put together the perfect Putnam's Camp 4th of July, the way Danbury area celebrated annually their 4th of July. And it's much more successfully knitted together in the late version. But still, the early version, you listen to the early version of the piece and think, well, that's the piece. I'm not sure I noticed what was different. And yet there's a lot of compositional stuff that went into it. Nothing can hurt the central message. The reason he wrote this music really comes through any version, large or small orchestra.
So what is the central message, do you think, of Ives? I know that that's a big question too, and I know that everyone might have their own take, but I always feel like there is a message with Ives. I always feel like there is a bigger concept at play with Ives.
I didn't know it when it bit me listening to Leonard Bernstein and the 4th of July. I didn't know what it hit me. But I look back and I realize it all adds up to an extraordinary human being, an extraordinary dedication to humanity, a deep belief in all of us being just as good as him. And it's that honesty and that depth and that naivete, if you will, that is charismatic for me.
So when you are looking at the original pencil scores and in the Yale library, is that a kind of communion for you? And do those pencil markings speak to you in any specific way, having worked with Kirkpatrick and dedicating your life to this music?
Yeah, you see when you're, especially in the presence of the actual manuscripts, you see the flow, the energy, the frustrations on the page, the pressure of the pencil or the fast flow of it. Ives preferred pencil because, of course, it's easy to make changes, but it also has to do later, it developed into a necessity because he had a palsy, his handshake that frustrated him. This all has to do with his diabetes and the advancing age. And so he preferred, if he had a pencil, he could connect with the page. If he was using an ink pen, which he did because he knew that people wanted final scores and ink and all of this, but it was a challenge. He had to wait for good days to work with a ink pen because it was fluid and it just moved around the page too easily. And there are some famously shaky pages of Ives's hand where he was having to write even though it was a bad day. He had its ups and downs, but he tried to do most of his scoring when he had a good day.
You know, as a young composer, I was so taken by Ives in so many different ways. I think he's a model for us in terms of viewing material for what it needs to be set properly, having the idea that nothing's really finished and things are sort of in flux and growing, and so many other areas. His use of quarter tones, his idea of shadow counterpoint, which I've always been fascinated by that term. I wonder if you could talk about what you've discovered in the scores about that term shadow counterpoint.
Even as early as the Third Symphony, which dates back to 1904 through 1909 when it was really finally codified, there are a lot of shadow lines. And these are mysterious, usually chromatic, usually unrelated in key, that noodle around and sort of create a weaving of a texture, like Ives was creating some kind of tweed, you know, and there's the subtlety in there, a blue thread you don't even notice because you're interested in the red and gray that predominate in the texture of the tweed. It's that sort of thing. He was fascinated even earlier with just the idea of layering just in multi keys. As we talk, I'm interrupting work on some of Ives's exercises, things that he did either at Yale for his classes, counterpoint exercises and the such, or ones that he did as spoofs and entertainment, where there are things in two keys. And I'm halfway through engraving an exercise, no, a burlesque harmonization is what John Kirkpatrick calls it, of London Bridge, where the left hand's in G flat and the right hand is in F. It's a wild sound. So that's layering of a sort. And he did that in 1891. So we're talking way before he got to New Haven for his prep school and then Yale. So it's about the time that he wrote the Variations on America, which of course also has some bitonal things in it that are there with the original. They're not added so much later as the original itself.
And is it your belief that this is coming from the experience of the Danbury Parade bands passing each other and how he would have encountered naturalistic bitonalities?
Yeah, sure, because his father kept pointing out the amazing things that were going on that are standard in everybody's life daily, and we don't recognize that they are this multiplicity, this layering, these coincidental events. The famous one being the marching bands going through each other, but that's more contrived than the standard ones that are happening while some music, well, take Central Park in the Dark or whatever, you've got the sounds of the city that are on a quiet level. You have the actual music that's coming from a dance hall somewhere around, and the pianist goes bananas. And these are what Ives' father kept pointing out to him. Isn't that fun? Listen to that. The bells are ringing at the same time that someone's playing piano, practicing an aria next door to our house on Main Street in Danbury. And Ives became very aware of reality and humanity. I mean, again, he really likes the human experience, the real things that happen, and not a contrived Victorian piece, but rather the way. Well, one of the things he said about the Concord, actually about the Hawthorne movement of the Concord, is it's not what happens, but the way that it happens. Accidentals and everything that comes in, not just a piece, but the whole environment. That led to a lot of this shadowing.
So this also ties in easily to my next question, which is, then he's also tapped into the spatialization of music.
Oh my goodness, yes, from early on, and those marching band ones would be an example. And then later he did a kind of skeletal version of that with the Calcium Light Night, which has 4 different fraternities being represented by just 4 instrumentalists: piccolo, clarinet, trumpet, trombone, and drums and things going on at the same time. And that was about these various marching bands all doing their own tunes, fraternity songs, at the same time. And then from a distance, coming close to you, and then rounding the corner and going away distant. It speeds up as it gets close. It gets loud as it gets close. And then it seems to lose energy and tempo as it goes at a distance. These are all acoustical observations of George Ives for his son to appreciate. And then you get to the 4th Symphony and others, the second orchestral set, and there are substantial distant sounds that are to be subliminal and embedded and off stage. And all this comes from things like George Ives playing his cornet or his horn from across a pond. And it leads Ives to do a memorable piece for his father called Remembrance and The Pond. Each this basically the same music in different dress.
That's a favorite of mine. The other pieces that I think of in this terms, in these terms of spatialization, are Yale Princeton football match, the General Slocum, which I was thinking about.
That has layers.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the General Slocum to the point where I researched the incident itself, and I think that is the biggest New York disaster.
Yes.
Until 9/11.
That's right.
Right. So it really,
like 1,300 people or so.
Over 1,300 people are killed in the New York waters off of New York City. And it would have been a big impact on Ives. And I think it's even possible that he would have known people that were killed or people that knew people that were killed. So it was really a community event, particularly since it's like Lower Manhattan, where the Ives would have had a place, right? And also in a German neighborhood, and it was predominantly a German church that was affected by this incident.
That's right. It was a church group, right? Yeah.
And mostly women and children. So you can see the humanity part kicking in.
Yeah. Yes. Interesting, because if you look at all of the history going on at the time, you'd say, well, gee, why didn't he memorialize that? Why didn't you react to that? He did to that one for reasons you were just mentioning, the sociological things about it. And it was horrific, of course, and it was close by. And then in 1915, 9 years later, he reacts to the sinking of the Lusitania not only because of the loss of lives, but because of the portent of war. It deeply affected him. And that's an amazing movement, the last movement of the second orchestral set.
I'm fascinated by the orchestral sets. There are 10. How are there more?
Oh, no, sorry, 10 chamber sets. There are 3 orchestral sets, large orchestra.
Okay. So the orchestral sets would be constituted by what?
3 Places in New England is the first orchestral set, and also called a New England Symphony. And the second orchestral set and third orchestral set are just so. Ives, after writing 3 symphonies, became resistant to, suspicious of using the term symphony, even though he called 3 Places a New England Symphony. And it began using the word set just to be more generic, and to move to the 3-movement form of, say, La Mer, which may have been the impressive model for a 3-movement, especially slow, fast, slow, the way Ives ended up shaping his pieces.
Did he like Debussy?
Sorry?
Did he enjoy Debussy's music?
He quoted it, Afternoon of a Faun. I don't think there's a lot of comment about it. He was probably very impressed, maybe even intimidated by that level of orchestral mastery, which Ives was never really a master of orchestration. He was good at it, but he didn't make a point of it the way, say, Richard Strauss, Respighi, or Debussy would have.
So the movement that really impresses me is Elegy for Our Forefathers. A
very warm piece. I think when I recorded it with Malmo Symphony for Naxos, that I made it sound particularly well because Ives asked for muted trumpet to be the main melody. And with the violins doubling, American orchestras in particular stuff your basic metal mute in, and that is a really bad mixture and doesn't get what Ives was after. He wanted something to be veiled and darker. When he says muted, he's not looking for that buzzy, jazzier sound that came later. So I had them playing with a softer kind of mute, and even a little oilcloth draped over the bell as well, and had that mixture with the, I used multi-trumpets doing it to make the whole thing blend best. You'll listen to that and you'll hear the melody, I think, the way I've really wanted that movement to be. I mean, that's a beautiful elegy. It's, in a way, an elegy to his own father, because his father was from literally the generation of the Civil War, and really grew up with Foster's songs. So I think there's a lot of depth hidden in that movement for Ives in relationship to his father.
I really wanted to ask you about discoveries when you go back to the pencil. And I had something that I looked for that you pointed out to me, was when you look in the ledger, the sides of the pencil scores of the Ives Fourth Symphony.
Oh, yes.
You see math problems. You see arithmetic scribbling.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk about that and any other surprising discoveries that you made when you were going through his original hand.
Well, yeah, and we often see Ives trying to mathematically parse some of the relationships of his layering. He both wants it to sound free, but he's self-conscious about being received as a proper composer. And so he works at being quite exact in laying out the engraving of his music. So he wants to make sure it all adds up, even though it's going to sound like it has nothing to do with itself in the layers. And the last movement of Three Places New England has a rolling bass line in the Housatonic at Stockbridge. And he's very careful to make that seem rational on the page, even though it's actually supposed to be fluid and free. So he's working to be mathematical. I mean, remember that he's an insurance agent who is parsing numbers all the time. And so he knows his basic math. Sadly, while he was at Yale, he got a D+ in algebra, but that did not stop him from being one of the country's most successful and affluent businessmen.
What were some of the surprises that you encountered when you've gone through the originals?
Well, I harken back to the very first involvement I had when I came to work with John Kirkpatrick. He wanted me to immediately work on Three Places in New England. And I realized, looking at the sketches, that while we were missing his early score, we had pages 2 through 9 of the first movement, the St. Gaudens, but we didn't have the first page. And I could see in the sketches that he had worked on a magical chord, piling up of A minor and F sharp at the beginning of the piece, this dense, dusty, low chord that is such a powerful evocation. And that it struck me. I told John Kirkpatrick, the way we know this piece, that first bar wasn't there. You could see. And then while I was working on it, Vivian Perlis had done in one of her interviews with Goddard Lieberson at Columbia Records, and Goddard Lieberson gave her a bound book of the St. Gaudens movement. It was pages 2 through 9 were photostats. The first page was the missing page, the actual manuscript. I couldn't believe it. It shows up, and there you go. The piece started with bar 2, and I showed it to John Kirkpatrick, and we were like, wow, so of course I recorded it in the version 1. That opening chord's not there. In version 2 and 3 and 4, it's there. But that was just one of those thrilling moments of looking at the sketches and being able to imagine what that first page was like, and I was right.
That's so cool. I think about you and Kirkpatrick, but I also think about the earlier supporters of Ives' music, and that he had a fan in Lou Harrison and even Gustav Mahler.
And Henry Cowell and Nicholas Solimsky and a few other composers, Becker, Furness, they're hardly known. But yes, Mahler shared the same copy bureau. Ives could afford the best, and he was at Tam's copy bureau getting his works copied out, and they had wonderful people there. And Mahler went to the same place because it was the go-to on 23rd Street, so down a bit from where the New York Philharmonic was playing, of course. I don't know where Mahler lived in the city, but everyone had to go to that area. It also became sort of the Tin Pan Alley for songwriting in the next decade. So while Ives was having his Third Symphony copied out, Mahler was in there for his purposes, and he took a look at the score that the copyist was working on and said, ask the composer whether I could have this score, which Ives said, fine, finish the copying and give it to him, then start another one for me. We don't have that score. It went with Mahler on his last trip back to Europe. And of course, he passed away about 4 months after he had picked up this score at the Thames Bureau. And these other folks, as we were saying, Slimsky was a conductor and the amanuensis to Boston Symphony's Koussevitzky, an immigrant from Russia, and the greatest raconteur storyteller I've ever heard. And Henry Cowell, who was a composer and a active publisher, editor, and had set up the new music editions to publish new music. And the coincidence of his first publication was Carl Ruggles' Men in Mountains, I think. And Ives saw that there was a new edition coming out, so he subscribed to this new quarterly, I think, publication of scores, and he just flipped out because he didn't know anything about Ruggles, and here was this bold music that had internal logic to it, and it was very bravely dissonant. So he discovered a lifetime friend there, and told this publisher, Cowell, said, send me 20 copies, send me 30 copies. He would helping them. And then he became simply the $1,000 a year, which back then was, $20,000 a year or something. He was underwriting anybody's music, and Cowell said, I want to publish some of your music. And Ives was very reticent about that. He was embarrassed. He wanted to support new music, not himself, but he eventually did allow the new music to publish some things and republish some of the songs that Ives had privately printed in the 114 songbook. So yeah, there was a coterie of supporters there that helped his music forward, helped to get it published, helped to get it performed. And in fact, with Cowell's new music recordings, later they became a label in which Ives's music was going to be heard.
But isn't it true that most of his music he did not hear in his lifetime?
Yeah. And certainly didn't hear it done well. I mean, he would hire New York Philharmonic players or New York Symphony players. Those were two separate groups at the time, and bring those professionals over to his apartments and pay them to rehearse through music with him waggling, I suppose, some kind of conducting. And he was always very disappointed. Washington's birthday, just, they could barely get through it, and nobody was happy. And, it was just a tough experience. When he took things like the ragtime dances over to the theaters, first here in New Haven at the Hyperion Theater and in New York, I've found that they were way better at sight reading and way more interested in something that was out of their daily grind of accompanying vaudeville shows or silent movies. So he was really in love with that kind of professional musician and not impressed with what he was getting out of the major orchestras.
And this is such an interesting view into his personality, because I really think of Ives as being anti-snob and a real man of the people. Do you think that that's fair?
Yes. He remained a small town Danbury boy with brilliant ideas. He was in New York because that was a necessity. He knew, from even when he was entering Yale, his father said, look, you've got to go to New York. You've got to be a businessman to be able to be yourself as a composer. That was quite true. And Ives' father died in his second month at Yale, freshman year. But Ives held that as an imperative and followed through, went to New York, went into the bottom actuarial level of the insurance business, saw what was wrong, decided he was going to start his own business, 1906, and then by 1909, Ives and Merrick is the #1 insurance agency in the United States.
So he becomes a model for people like Frank Zappa and composers who realize they have to make money somehow,
Right?
so they can do whatever the hell they want in music.
Yes. There are a lot of people that have been literally inspired by Charles Ives, directly inspired. I keep some track whenever I see it mentioned. Let me see. I've got some of that at hand. We're just looking, especially at all the jazz musicians who have said in liner notes or whatever of their indebtedness to Ives, and those include Bobby McFerrin and Bruce Hornsby, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, Phil Lesh of the Grateful Dead, the jazz flutist Jamie Baum, the rock band Mother Hips. There's a long list of these who say that they, like Bruce Hornsby told me that whenever he's looking for an interesting chord to generate something, he just looks at Charles Ives' music and finds these fantastic piles of pitches that often start as a system. Let's say just building a chord in alternating major and minor thirds or something. But Ives engages his ear. At some point he says, I'm gonna move that up. That'll be a fourth right in the middle of the chord, but it's just a better note, you know. And he makes them magical. He makes incredible chords by ear, starting with a system usually, and then just going crazy. But for all good reasons, because he had a brilliant ear. I think that Charles Ives would be the perfect candidate in a generation later to be a jazz musician. And I think you hear Ives improvise on some of the recording. You know, there's a CD that I did of all of the recordings that Ives did. There's a lot on there where McCoy Tyner would say, yeah, man, where's this cat?
Yeah, in fact, I would like to throw in also that Alan Holdsworth, the advanced harmonic mind of guitar in jazz, was a Ives fan.
Yeah,
and if you listen to the first opening chords of Central Park in the Dark, there's your Holdsworth chords, and I put that for Holdsworth aficionados, and they say, yeah, well, obviously. So
the opening of Central Park in the Dark is so incredibly dense, but it is exactly like the density of the heat and humidity in Central Park. I mean, it's amazing how that evokes that close air.
That's an excellent observation, because and you say, oh, well, this is summertime. It's summer heat. It's not the middle of the winter for me when I hear it.
No, he does icy sounds too, because I think the opening of Washington's Birthday is very icy.
Yeah.
But that deeper density of the sounds in Central Park in the Dark is because it's summer and it's warm. It's humid.
Where do you think his love of the tone poem comes from? Is that also from his dad and just trying to represent impactful scenes in his life? Where is this coming from?
Well, it's enabled by Franz Liszt and the tone poem, and then Debussy, La Mer, etc., and Richard Strauss. He would have known those scores would have been published, and Yale would have had them. But the tone poem allowed him to come close to the humans and the memories and the memorializing of his father. So the holidays, incredibly important to all families. And those, I think, are, well, obviously Decoration Day is very much a singular homage to his own father, because he was a Civil War band director, and it was really a piece of the Civil War. But all the movements are, and they're all deeply felt, and they're all about human events and multi, the multi-layered way that a barn dance happens or a street march happens, or absolutely magnificently at the climax of Thanksgiving, the way we arrive at boom, A major, when the piece has been nowhere close to it, is stunning. And the chorus is always one beat behind the organ, the orchestra, because I've experienced that, and he embraced it, and it makes that moment just transcendent with energy and reality, and of course the hymn is in E flat, and so he said it in A major. And wow, what a way to explode the climax. This is a real human experience. It's the way he had loved his church experience, and the way he loved people, and the way he could embrace chorus being a full beat behind, as congregations tend to do.
Now, you've been a consultant on other Ives projects, like the film Good Dissonance Like a Man, and also another more of a documentary, less of a sort of pastiche of events from his life. But in the visualization of one of my favorite Ives moments, the storm with the church bells, which leads George Ives, his father, to go to the piano and try to find these in between the notes chords.
Yeah.
Is this the first kind of quarter tone music that's happening in America?
Wow, probably. Who else? I mean, his father was the one who found that he could drape strings over a laundry rack, and he could add tension, and he could end up tuning them anywhere he wanted. He could detune his piano as well, because church bells have overtones and indeed an undertone that are not in tune with the standard scale. And a number of Ives' pieces try to evoke bell sounds, and it's interesting to see what he does. But ultimately, it would have to be a highly complex realization with quarter tones. And I think bell sounds that fascinated his father drove Ives to the awareness and interest in quarter tones. And of course, later, 3/4 tone pieces, memorably in the end of the, where does that happen? It's in the, 3/4 of the way through the second movement of the Fourth Symphony. Yeah. There is a magical place of the violin soloist, who incidentally is supposed to be off stage, not upright by the microphone the way everybody records it, playing Beulah Land, and the quarter tone piano is off stage there, noodling around in the most magnificent cloud of it's off the earth. It's an amazing sort of celestial experience going on. Quarter tones, I mean, he made them beautiful.
Yeah.
I don't think that there is a more amusing piece than the fast ragtime-based movement of the quarter tone pieces. You really miss quarter tones when you aren't hearing the quarter tones in that piece. It's amazing. He saw a whole language, and he wanted to create some sort of system basis to use quarter tones in the chorale movements, on either side of the center movement of the three pieces for quarter tones. He worked on it, but this was all relatively late in his life, and it probably didn't get carried through so well that he could publish a document about how to use quarter tones, but he showed us. It's fantastic. Alan Stout arranged that for strings, where it's much easier to get it, all that tuning. It's kind of interesting.
Let's talk about the Fourth Symphony a little bit, because I have to say, one of the most incredible musical experiences I've had in my life, hearing it live in concert, with the musicians off stage, musicians in the balconies, musicians behind you.
Right.
Why is that piece so special?
Well, it's certainly visionary, isn't it? It is the greatest collection of Ives's advanced ideas. The first movement was created as a prelude to the piece. He toyed with whether it should go right into the fugue to be the academic aspect of the searching for an answer. It's basically is the symphony is the unanswered question in full orchestra. So he decided, however, to go with the scherzo of the comedy movement, as he called it, for the second movement, the third movement being the academic striving for an answer, the comedy movement, a profane attempt to answer the question asked in the first choral aspect of the piece. The watchmen tell us of the night, and
what the signs of promise are.
Yeah, what the signs of promise are. And the last movement is the answer, finally, a search like very similar to the third movement of the second string quartet, which has some finale in common, the descending whole tone scales. And it becomes climb the mountain, be nearer to God, embrace nature. There's a wonderful moment in the last movement before the coda brings us to the D octave scale of whole tones under Nearer My God to Thee. And that is a giant cutoff with a little bit of the distant percussion ensemble that has been ticking away, the sort of machinations of earth going on, even while all of these bigger questions are being contemplated. And we hear sparkles, twitters of sound from piccolo, oboe, etc. The exciting thing that I discovered in the pages of the music was that Ives wrote wood thrush over those. And I realized that these are actually a wood thrush, these little instrumental sounds, which are a bird sound that he heard all the time around his home. And if you look at the in the third movement, as he changed the fugue to end with why am I losing the you hear the trombone, and you wonder, why is that there? Mm-hmm. Well, the last verse of that is about nature and embracing nature, the heavenly sounds and nature's sounds. And the last movement then starts to answer that, and it has nature's sounds and the heavenly sounds. You know, it's actually really important that that's the end of Joy to the World, right? That is there, but it's not the joy to the world. It's that last verse of the hymn that sets up the last movement. Very tightly subject related. And of course, that last movement begins with a mystical expansion on the opening first movement. So he's making it cyclic. This he learned from Dvorak, you know, the most important composer model that Ives had at that time.
But did he admit openly to having models and having people that inspired him? He seemed so close to the vest on these things, right?
Not so much. But there's no question that Dvorak was in New York there when he was when Ives was starting to be a composer, 92, and was one of the most important composers in the world. So it was very exciting that he was in New York. He said American composers have to go to American music roots. And almost everybody went running to the side of the ship saying, oh, let's write Indian, Native American music, you know? And there was a spate of that, but nobody wanted to touch blacks because it was too far below the class. It was the wrong side of the tracks. Ives thought ragtime music was the answer. He thought that gospel was the answer. And he drew that into his music singularly. He was the only one. I mean, who else would have written St. Gaudens in 1912 when and embraced ragtime music at a time when it was red light district? If you were going to even hear ragtime music, you had to completely leave your white culture. Ives saw across the chasm. He saw the greatness of Black American music. He saw it as the honest roots. I mean, he referred to ragtime as this is the ore that we will make our great music from, and he showed us.
Yes, he's uniquely embracing American, and at the same time pushing away post-Germanic tradition.
Yes. I mean, he was well versed in it, and he owed to the Germanic through his teacher Horatio Parker at Yale. He owed his ability to do larger forms, his awareness of what an orchestra should be able to do. He took it on a kind of utilitarian level, but he wasn't interested in mixtures and of sound. He was interested in more like just the sound levels, of the such. Interesting, because he was an organist. You'd think he would have been pulling stops and finding mixtures, but it didn't interest him so much. And it may have been even in his performance as an organist, of which he was a virtuoso. He may have been relatively straightforward in the colors he used, because I would say that was reflected in his orchestra. But yes, he was rejecting Germanic influences. At the same time, he was training himself to be a broader, fuller composer by learning from the Germans.
Do you think that Olivier Messiaen was inspired by Ives?
I don't know that. Interesting. I don't know the writings that Messiaen might have expressed admiration, but all of these people are aware of Ives, even if they haven't said about it. It's a giant force, the ghost hovering over everybody. I mean, he is so singular. There is nothing like it. Maybe just Waldo, who completely stepped out of their era and wrote another kind of music. We're just coming to terms with it, I'd say. 1974 was a giant turning. 1939 was a giant turning point when the Concord Sonata was played, but for 38 people in the audience or something. But 1974 was a very big deal, and it really kicked a lot of literature into recording and a lot more performance levels. In fact, I remember the BMI people saying that since 1974, there hasn't been a year where Ives's performance levels haven't grown.
Oh,
that's amazing. So it wasn't a bump, it was a launching pad, 1974.
Okay, yeah, I was curious about.
In 2 years, we have the 150th. 2024 will probably be another very big reconsidering of Charles Ives's total work, and of course, I'm hoping for this Naxos Records to have completed all of Ives's orchestral music, so things that could be premiered have gotten to disc, and that it's all there for consideration.
What can we look forward to from Naxos from you?
Well, I've just recorded the 10 chamber sets for chamber orchestra, which are 36 movements, and the 3 movements of that are the set for theater orchestra. So Ives's complete chamber orchestra literature of that genre. And we'll do the Fourth Symphony and Universe Symphony on a disc next year. And then by the time we get to the sesquicentennial 2024, I hope that my orchestra in New England will have recorded the miscellaneous, the leftovers, which include the ragtime dances. I've recorded these before, but not for Naxos. So the ragtime dances, Ives's arrangements that he had done to learn orchestration here at Yale, a piece that I put together that is 100% Charles Ives, but it's interesting, chunky fragments and incomplete works. Opens with a smashing march that suddenly stops because that's all we've got. Ives had it full score and we don't know where the rest of the pages are. And it goes into funny chords and cute little duets. Then you noodled like a 5-note sequence with a chord under it called Sunrise over East Rock. And there are all kinds of marginalia essentially in Ives that I put together into a single movement. It's about 8 minutes long and it's pretty entertaining. I don't want to record that because it's 100% true Ives. It's just collecting the dustbin into one place and making something out of it. There's Gong on the Hook and Ladder. There's all kinds of pieces that are orchestral but haven't fit on any other disc. So that will be the complete. When you do those last 2 symphonies, you've done 9 symphonies. That's what I've said when he had done, at that point, 7 symphonies before he completed the, or even started the Universe Symphony and the 3rd orchestral set. He said, I've done 7 symphonies. They are, the Holiday Symphony, the Numbered Symphonies, the New England Symphony, which is orchestral set number 1, and then he did orchestral set 2, 3, the Universe Symphony, and you have 9.
I have to say, I've always been fascinated by the Universe Symphony. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could talk, I know people will be very interested, what is it coming from? What is the original source material? How is one able to create a realization of such a piece? What did he leave us? What has been added? What has to be grown from it?
Well, there are 34 pages of music that he left us. And early on in the late teens, it was a piece that he could orchestrate, and he wrote it down. One of the preludes is fully complete, and it's a 6.5-minute arch of a basic duration and then half its duration, and it builds up to 17 over the basic duration. 6.5 minutes. He wants you to repeat it often. When I've done it, I've just done it twice. It gives you 13 minutes of prelude, and then section A, B, and C. And he wrote down and orchestrated section A. He then wrote a coda for section A. He decided later, as he worked on section B and C, to grab that coda that he completed for section A and make it the final piece in the whole of the work. I've performed it with that prelude in its 2 cycles, the percussion cycles, and then section A with the coda, which originally was section A. And that written out part of the music is 15 minutes. So you've got together about a half-hour piece. And that's how we'll record it. It has 4 distant ensembles. And one should realize, especially in Cowell's book, one gets the impression of mountaintops and sort of like, is he crazy idea that there are going to be ensembles miles apart or something on top of mountains, or at least half miles apart on top of mountain peaks in the Adirondacks. The reality is that Ives had visited a place called Dramamont that a fellow named Whitmer owned, and it was a something like a Tanglewood, where he would invite people to come and perform and do artsy things, whether it was dance or singing or whatever. And he liked new stuff. And I went and visited and had real ideas that, this is where we can do the Universe Symphony. And it got him excited once again in the late teens about his Universe Symphony material, which started around 1915. And there you had open spaces and little hills and the such, well within shouting distance, well within being part of the same ensemble. So on that level of separation, 100 feet, 150 feet apart or whatever, you can have these 4 ensembles, which aren't large, maybe a dozen players in each of the ensembles, mostly strings, a flute, an oboe, a clarinet's in one of them, a keyboard is in one of them. So those are the satellite ensembles, and this central music happens. They all are, as Ives is always parsing numbers, those all actually add up to the same 16th note, even if they're floating away in their apparent cyclic beats. So that literally the safest way to do the piece is with one conductor and one 16th note, and everybody follows one thing at a beat of 60 to the quarter note. That's what Ives defined, half note to the 30 at 30. And I've done it. It's not hard to pull off. It's very interesting, and the writing is all abstract. I don't believe that there's an apparent quotation in it. There's something buried in there. I can't even recall what that would be. It's not in the performing part that I've done. It's in the other sections. And then, of course, there have been several people. Larry Austin comes to mind, who did a realization. He was looking at the Part B and Part C material and deciding to then write his piece inspired by that material. But none of it sounds like the actual core Ives piece that is performable. So it'll be a bit of a revelation when you hear the Universe in its actual Ives scored, organized manner of the music. There was also Johnny Reinhardt, who's a quarter-tone specialist, and he did a version of it. I heard the live performance, I heard the recording. I'm still baffled by it, but at any rate, he also did a version of the Universe Symphony, and those end up being about 1 hour long when they spin things out.
Is that because of the number of repeats being open?
No, they spin out material that otherwise we can't join, just a whole bunch of sketches. And each one of them then use that material just to weave something together. It doesn't have Ives's continuity blessing on it, but it's working with the material.
And can you tell us what he's trying to represent with this Universe Symphony? Because
he's in the Adirondacks in the summer when he really got engaged with this piece, and he was so impressed with the mountaintops. They're basically green mountains, they're not up in the bald mountain effect with snow caps, but they're handsome. And for somebody who had lived in New York most of the time, it was a inspiring, uplifting, cathedral-like, if you will, experience of looking up. And that's what he wanted to write, some bold music that was as strong as nature. And my friend, long past now, David Porter, who did a lot of work on Charles Ives, did most of the work that we have of scholarship on the Universe Symphony. And he made an interesting distinction. He said in the first concept that Ives had for the Universe Symphony, it was a Newton world of physics. and there were practical sides, and he could write it down. And when he returned to that material in the 1920s and started fussing some, it was post-Hubble. So he said, this is the Hubble universe, not Newtonian universe. And so there's a big difference. It goes from the practical and gravity to later a much more conceptual, open, spiritual quest in the work.
What do you feel is the situation with performance of Ives' music currently? If we talk about appreciation of his work in America versus the rest of the world, what are you observing?
Well, I think it's climbed its own mountain. In the early days in Charles Ives' lifetime, there were scant performances that were any good. When they were good enough to be recorded, they are an embarrassment for us to listen to now. His songs were recorded by some middling singers and orchestral muddy recordings by, say, William Strickland back in the day, you know, recording with the Iceland Symphony Orchestra and that kind of thing. All a step forward in their time. But now there is a very strong sense of how these pieces go. But what we lack uniquely with Charles Ives is his hand on coaching people through Ives's music performance. There's no handoff. John Kirkpatrick should be an example, but John Kirkpatrick was a very classical-minded composer, performer, and Charles Ives is a very romantic, minded composer. As forward-thinking as he was still a romantic Victorian composer. And he sat down to play the Concord Sonata for Charles Ives at the Ives House in West Reading, and never got past page 1. I mean, literally just page 1 of Emerson, and immediately was hustled off the bench. And Charlie sat down and said, "Oh, I play it this way now." We have a thing called the Emerson transcriptions, which are Ives's later kind of redo of stuff. So Ives's mind was now beyond that printed page from 1920, the early version of the Concord Sonata. And John Kirkpatrick was a neat and tidy performer. Impressive because he memorized the piece before he premiered it. Wow, that was a commitment. But I'm saying that Charles Ives never had a chance to coach John Kirkpatrick in what he would expect from that piece. He showed him some things, but that was about it, Emerson only. And then you've got, Bernstein premiered the Second Symphony in 1951. Ives couldn't go. He listened on radio. He had Harmony, his wife, write a letter to Bernstein. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The fast movements weren't fast enough. Bernstein later recorded it in 1957, a bit slower than he did it in the performance premiere that Ives was criticizing. And later in 1989, just before he died, maybe it's 1988, before he died, Bernstein wanted to do the Fourth Symphony with Columbia Records, but he couldn't face the condition of the performing materials. He gave up. He recorded the Second Symphony. Wouldn't you know, the one thing that Charles Ives has ever told any conductor that we know of, play those movements faster. He played them slower. But that was Bernstein in his late years. His Schumann would stand still and smell the roses. And I love Bernstein.
Yes.
But let's face it, he got very slow when he got sentimental. And so it's too bad. I mean, nobody, not even the people who premiered the music, not me, ever had any chance for Charles Ives to coach us. I get some credence to what I do because I'm so close to the manuscripts and I know all the angles on, the ragtime music may have a tempo here and the piano sonata may have a tempo there, and you bring them all together and you realize the material's the same and you can use that tempo. When you're deeply in it like that, you have a chance of scraping out the core information that you can get that Charles Ives left us. In the end, this music belongs to the performer. It's music of the heart. You can play it slow if you play it right for your heart. You can play it mad, crazy fast, like Charles Ives tends to do everything he has on his recording. And that's right too. It is, as we were saying about jazz, it is the jazz musician. This music grows. It's never the same. I don't want it to be, as Charles Ives would evoke it, I can play it this way on a Sunday, but by Saturday, it's a whole different thing. It should be living. It should be different. I welcome lots of other people's take on the music and performance styles. I just wish that Charles Ives had more people that were at a high level of performance, not say Nicholas Slanimsky, who was really a pretty awkward conductor. I saw him. And he was there, able to ask Ives questions, but we don't know, that Ives really, I tried to get this out of Nicholas Slanimsky. I said, what did he ever say to you? And you would get 3 of the most delicious anecdotes, God knows what they were, unrelated to what you had asked him, but he would immediately have some great stories to tell you, and apparently couldn't nail down anything that Ives had actually told him. Well, he did send a telegram to Paris when Slanimsky, at Ives's expense, took the Boston Chamber Orchestra over to Europe, hired a bunch of Parisian musicians, and played the European premiere of 3 Places in New England. And he kept writing back to Ives, wiring back to Ives, I need another rehearsal, send some more money. Ives did that. Finally, the last request for more rehearsal, Ives said, enough, you should just play this piece. Just go at it. The spirit is more important than the notes. Give it a kick up the Eiffel Tower. There's your advice. Just
performance
go.
Practice. There it is. Just go kick it.
Well, Ives is interesting. He's not Bach or Mozart in the sense that those crystalline pieces really have to be what's on the page, or you're violating it. Ives is almost uniquely sturdy. He said the notes don't matter. I'm only quoting him, but in a sense, notes don't matter. It really is about the spirit of the music. Now, you don't want to play wrong notes, but you don't want to get hung up about whether a wrong note ever happens, because it's just the forward flow of this, the message, the underlying heart, the feeling that's in this, the humanity that's in this music is what it's about.
Super jazz aesthetic, for sure.
Yes. Yes.
Right? And then also the thing that Cage pointed out that I really hadn't put together until I read this was he's also involved with indeterminacy, because he has these open elements and he has performer choice. You could go this way, you could go that way.
Yes, right. Well, that's part of the theater orchestra experience. It doesn't matter what instruments playing. It can be but in his solo work, in these 10 chamber sets that I just recorded, it's, the first thing he says might be English horn, but you could use trumpet, you could use oboe, you could use basset horn, you could use French horn. You could take it down an octave and do it on trombone. Play the piece, don't stop because of some little thing like my orchestration, because the core of the piece is not about the orchestration.
And how about the plasticity that you get from these choices? I mean, isn't that also something very jazz and very American?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's no wrong performance of the unanswered question. It floats wherever it wants to. and a good deal of the Central Park in the Dark, which is in one thing a pairing of two contemplations. I mean, these pieces, nothing can go wrong. Whatever happens, you know, if you can play the piece at all, whatever happens is a real good representation of what Ives was after.
And he's onto these concepts in the beginning of the 20th century. Really, at the turn of the century, he's already onto these concepts.
Visionary. He was a visionary in business, and he was a visionary in music. And I think you would say sociologically, he was a visionary too. He just didn't have biases. He didn't. His generation, you could say, were all misogynist, and you can read his writing and say, oh, look, but I mean, everybody expressed themselves that way. That was all standard business. Characterizing people as female or pansy-assed or something like that, he would say, composer. He is not really trying to demean women or pansies. But rather just speaking the language they had. I mean, we're all guilty of that. We express ourselves in our current terms. A generation from now, they will think, how in the hell did these guys say that? That's rude. Well, it wasn't rude right now. We didn't see it that way. No one else reacted that way. But a later generation will decide that there are things to be canceled about the previous generation.
Yes, for sure. And it always heartened me that Ives was impatient with people who couldn't hang with some gnarly, complex, or dissonant music, and he'd say, "Use your ears, your lily white ears, and sort of get off of your little couch there and stand up to the music." And I always felt that way, even though it might not be PC to say so, but it's kind of like, yeah, there's other stuff besides pop music that's going to be worth your time, American and other wise people.
The pop music that Ives was dealing with was largely Victorian and Tin Pan Alley, which can seem pale to us, but he embraced it. He quoted it. He elevated it, if you will, by putting it into complex compositions with texture and layers going on. He embraced it because those were items of humanity. They were representations of real people in real lives. If there was him being weaved into an Ives piece, there was in Ives's mind and heart an actual congregation or an actual soloist singing that right there. These were human references while they were musical references. He's weaving humanity, not just a quotation into his music.
So true. He's living it.
Very much. It's a very special case in music history. A very special case. A remarkable human, but also an amazing mind. So I never get tired of it. I'm still dedicated to it every day.
I know you are.
We will have the complete works of Ives in new critical editions for the sesquicentennial.
The complete?
They're complete.
Jim Sinclair, you're unbelievable.
Well, just cranking. It's my daily bread.
That's a real good crank to be on, I have to say.
And I love it. It's a realization of that moment that I wanted to own it all when I first heard that 4th of July played by Bernstein and New York Philharmonic on TV. Oh my God, I want to find more of this. And I wanted to buy every score. I wanted to buy every record. I do own every record and every CD that's ever been released on Ives' music. And I now am responsible for getting it all edited. Incidentally, you're looking in the backyard here. This is the needlepoint that was done for Ornette's recording of Three Places in New England in 1974. 3, I think they recorded it. And his notion, her notion, the artist never saw the St. Gaudens monument. So that's a monument to the soldiers. And this is the Putnam's camp. And this is the river of the Housatonic. And this is a painting done by Ives's grandnephew, in which there are all kinds of elements. Right here is Ives's house at Reading, and there is a arch of the Celestial Railroad with the train cars on it. There are the church up here with the steeples and the trees of pine trees of Pine Mountain, which was right next to Ives's birth home area, and there are clouds up here. And if you were really able to somehow zoom in or whatever, you see that they're all all string instrument bodies are the clouds, which is a fantastic thing. And then look right over my shoulder right here, Ives's face ghostly on the face of everything else. A wonderful bearded Charles Ives from late in his life. Fantastic thing. Incidentally, this, let me see, this part right here, this lower quadrant, was used on the Naxos recording of the 4th of July and other holiday movements, etc. That lower quadrant was the picture. And when we released the 10 sets and set for theater orchestra, it'll be this upper quadrant here with the church steeple in it, because there's a lot of hymn music quoted in the sets. The guy's a painter, and he lives in he's about my age. He lives in Texas, in a trailer park, and he gets outside his trailer park with his easel, and he puts on Ives's music on a turntable, and then starts painting.
And that's what it sounds like, and that's what it looks like.
Well, it's virtually a visual riot going on there. It's very much 4th of July. Yeah.
Jim, what a pleasure to speak with you and to commune with Ives music with you. Please tell people the top 3 pieces they should listen to if they're not really familiar with Ives.
Oh my goodness.
Tough question.
Well, I don't know. What worked for me was hearing the Second Symphony. I just related to that kind of the quotations that are in it, the warmth of it, the Dvorak nature of the piece. That symphony is virtually what Dvorak asked America to compose. Charles Ives, I think, purposely composed the Second Symphony in response to where is the American Symphony? It is the American Symphony. That's not advanced Charles Ives, but it's an extremely attractive piece. And the 4th of July tone poem, I fell in love with it. Any American can relate to the 4th of July parades, and there it is. And then it's impossible to say. There are so many wonderful songs, really just embracing any song collection, having a copy. They're very inexpensive reprints of the 114 songbook. I've recently, during COVID, last several years, edited 187 editions of Ives' songs. That is to say, the complete songs in all their versions, all newly engraved and with critical apparatus. It's all going to be, I don't know what, on the Ives website for download, or something is about to be invented on how to allow the distribution of these new song versions.
What will the Ives website be?
CharlesIves.org.
CharlesIves.org.
Yeah, it's building out. It's got a lot of stuff on it. You can go and find pictures, you can find sound recordings, you can find interviews from Vivian Perlis's oral history projects, critical commentary on the pieces of music that aren't published with the scores that are published. Oh, there's Ives Remembered. Yeah, that's Vivian Perlis. She just passed away last year. She did that breakthrough work of interviewing people. You talked about the Fourth Symphony. Before we're off here, let me throw one anecdote in here. Vivian started that project of oral history accidentally. She was around working at the library, and John Kirkpatrick had come to campus, and she heard that somebody had passed away. Harmony Ives had passed away in '69, and she thought, oh my God, there are these people who we should have talked to. So I'm going to take a tape recorder and go and find. The first thing she did, she found Ives's business partner, Mike Myrick. And one of the interesting anecdotes that she got from that was that Mike Myrick was at the 1965 premiere of the Fourth Symphony. And he was in the audience, and Stokowski, and you can see the video of this from the film of the broadcast. Stokey is talking to the audience, and he says, everything is in this music. There are hymns, there are songs. And wouldn't you know, Mike Myrick sneezed, and Stokowski looked at me and goes, not that.
Wow.
So unbelievably, at the premiere of the Fourth Symphony, in the last years of his life, Mike Myrick, wonderful guy, I was his business partner, and the founder of the National Tennis Organization, ended up inadvertently part of the performance.
That's amazing. That's an amazing document.
But that's how valuable her work was, that she captured just before he died this wonderful, well, the whole interview is wonderful, but this anecdote about the Fourth Symphony where everything's in it, including Mike Myrick's sneeze at the first performance. Yes, well, look, it's complete pleasure to talk about Ives anytime. And you and I talked a lot a decade ago, and it's just charming to be together with you again. And your podcasts are probably very popular, and I'm honored to be a part of them.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. We do try to keep it interesting here, and you know, if you're looking for fascinating, you can't go much further than Charles Ives. Just every angle, any entrance to the edifice will be an interesting one, whether it's the choral music or the string quartets or the song, or even amazing. You know. And for a lot of my audience too, the experimental pieces, some of the first 12 tone stuff, and some of the aleatoric and chromatomellotune, exactly, tone roads.
Yes, tone roads. We'll record those.
I look forward to that. Jim Sinclair, what a pleasure. Thank you for all the work you've done for Charles Ives music, and thank you for talking to me today.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure.
Folks, thanks for listening. My guest has been James Sinclair, the conductor, and Ives scholar, and Ives champion. And we'll leave it there for today. Thanks, everybody. See you next time on the ProgCast.